Well, welcome to part 2 of Land Woman. I will put a link in the description below at part 1, something you probably ought to watch. And I'll see if I can't stick a link on the end of this video so you can go to it directly. But this is part 2. In the mid-1970s, I was just getting out of the United States Navy. I did 4 years, 3 months, and 1 day. I was happy to get out. But while in the U.S. Navy, I worked at a data center in Washington, D.C. And when I finally got out of the Navy, I went to work for a civilian data center outside of Washington, D.C., outside what's called the Beltway. And I had worked there about a year, and I get a phone call from a guy I used to work with while in the Navy. He worked at the data center with me. And we decided we'd have lunch together just to catch up. And we also learned that we both were working at a data center. So he suggested I come downtown to DC, we have lunch, we'll visit his data center, and then later he'll come out to Virginia and visit my data center. And I thought that was great. So we're having lunch in downtown Washington, D.C., just a block from the Capitol building. We finish lunch. I follow him over to a office building, nothing important about it, just an office building. And he walks me into this building, and now there's security everywhere. But we came out of a secure environment, so that was really common for both of us. So he gets me a visitor's badge, and he's wearing the escort badge, and he's walking me down the hall, and he says, "You do know where you are?" I said, "No, I have no idea where I am." He says, "This is the U.S. Senate data center." I said, "Really?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "The House of Representatives has their own data center, but it's in another building someplace else. And apparently these two groups don't get along." I said, "Well, whatever. Okay." So he walks me in through the doors, and here we are in the middle of a data center, and it is identical to my data center. It's identical to the data center that we both worked at a year ago in the Navy. There's big 1403 printers pushing out computer paper by the page, magnetic tape drives spinning all over the place, blinking lights for the console, identical to what we both had already known. So he introduced me around, we shook hands, "Hi, how are you?" And eventually I'm now leaving the data center, and we're walking out, and he's walking me towards the street, and we walk by this huge wall of mailboxes. And I said, what is this?" He says, "Those are the document boxes for the senators. We have 100 senators, you know." "Yeah, I don't know, what do you mean?" He says, "Well," he says, "the Senate has a huge mail room because the senators get tons and tons of mail. So all that mail has to be gone through and has to be sorted. And if there's any checks that are in the mail addressed to the senators, they get bundled up and put in these document boxes. And so twice a day, a staff member will come down, collect all the checks, take them back up for processing and deposit." He said, "You've heard the term you can buy a senator once a day?" He said, "That's not true. You can buy them twice a day because they do the same thing in the afternoon. So twice a day they come down and collect the checks." I thought that was kind of humorous, kind of funny. We chuckled about it. Out the door I went. The U.S. Senate. You can buy a senator twice a day. Land Woman. There it is, even at the Senate level. And I continued to run into Land Woman the rest of my career in Washington. While working at my civilian data center, I happened to be invited to dinner by one of the co-workers and her husband. So I was having dinner with them, and they lived in a townhouse community, something that was a kind of a new concept back then, a townhouse community. So there was a townhouse association, and my friend's husband, he was on the council of the townhouse. But they were having a problem with the development that was going to be going on right behind their community. And so the Townhouse Association decided that they needed to talk to the local politician to see what they could do about this. But there was an election coming up, and they didn't know who was going to get elected. So the Townhouse Association decided to buy all the candidates. I think there were 3 people running. And I asked, why do you do that? He says, well, we don't know who's going to win, so we're going to buy out, we're going to contribute to all 3 campaigns so that whoever does win will take our phone call to talk about this project that's going to go on behind our association. I said, well, that's an interesting strategy. I've kind of heard that before. He says, you do know the definition of an honest politician. I said, what was that? He says, once bought, stays bought. Once bought, stays bought. Lend woman. There it is again. There was a woman in Georgia, the state of Georgia, who was a head of a woman's center of some kind, but she was appointed by the governor. So she worked at the pleasure of the governor. But the governors would get reelected from time to time, and that put her job in jeopardy. So what she would do during the election cycle, she would send a check written to both candidates, sign her name on the check, and in the memo write campaign contribution, and then mail both checks off. The checks would come back in her bank statement at the end of the month, and she would wait for the election to finish, and whoever won the election, she would write a personal note. Congratulations on your election win. I am so happy you are our governor. And sign it. And in that note, she would put a copy of that canceled check and send the check off. That lady kept that job for 12 years. Lend woman. Once bought, stays bought. I spent my career consulting in Washington, D.C. I was a consultant and my clients were government agencies, so I roamed many halls of the government agencies. There was a senator from Texas, a Democrat, I believe. No need to mention his name. He left politics in 1999, and he has since passed away. But he had this Wednesday morning meeting that I always thought was important. You could have breakfast with the senator to share your ideas and your concepts, and I always thought that was kind of a good idea, of a way to understand what's going on with your constituents. The only catch was each seat at the breakfast table cost $10,000. So for $10,000, you could have Wednesday morning breakfast with the senator. I don't want to guess what it costs to have breakfast today with a senator. Lend a woman. You can sell yourself all day long. Back in 2016, we had the president election cycle. And during that time, the Democrats, their candidate was Mrs. Hillary Clinton. But the Republicans hadn't decided just yet who was going to be the candidate to run against Mrs. Clinton. So there were about 14 potential presidential candidates. And I happened to be living in Florida during that 2016 election cycle. And one of the candidates was a sitting senator named Marco Rubio. But Mr. Rubio had to give up his Senate seat if he wanted to run for President of the United States. And he did. And about 3 or 4 months into the process, it was becoming obvious that Senator Rubio was not going to be the nominee. So he withdrew from the presidential election, and he took up the task of running again for his Senate seat. And me being in Florida, I'm watching all of this advertising, and it was very ugly, But he won his seat back into the Senate. And he's coming out of a building after his announcement, and a local Florida reporter follows him out, puts a microphone to his face and says, "Senator, you do know that the local utility here contributed $213,000 to your campaign. What do you have to say about that?" And without a second breath, he said, well, they're supporting my agenda. I'm not supporting theirs. Lind Woman, alive and well in Florida. So Lind Woman has followed me all of my adult life. Every time I see a politician, I hear a politician, or I hear somebody talking about a politician, my first thought is Lind Woman. And I think there's something we can do to improve our politicians. But that's another video. It'll be a follow-up video, sort of. And I think I'm going to call it, I Need a Billionaire. Anyway, this is Dallas. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the follow-up. Hit the subscribe, hit the like, hit the share. Thanks.